Thank you, and good afternoon to you all.
Good afternoon.
I must say that I feel very privileged to be here. Aid to the Church in Need is an organization I not only feel very closely affiliated to, but have a great deal of respect for, because of the work that continues to be done, and because of the profile it has given and continues to give to people, Christians in particular, who are persecuted for their faith around the world. But it also has a heart for humanity and a heart for religious freedom, and we work quite closely on various religious freedom platforms. Here in Britain, I was also very privileged to have accompanied Neville and a group from ACN to Erbil last year, where we were able to see the work that ACN is doing on the ground, as well as the many thousands of people we met there who were directly and personally touched by what's happening in the Middle East, particularly Christians from Mosul who had lost everything and gone to Erbil. But there is so much to be done, and I am glad in this day and age that we are able to cooperate and collaborate for the sake of so many who need us to. I'm General Bishop of the Coptic Orthodox Church here in Britain. I've been here for 20 years. And on one side of things, I do very much believe in ecumenism. I believe in the body of Christ. I believe in the one church that we are promised we will have one day. Probably not in my lifetime, but we're still working towards it. Because and I know this sounds very cliche, so please forgive me, but what we have in common far, I think, outweighs what separates us. And especially when we look at humanitarian matters, matters of religious freedom, matters of Christian persecution, and so on and so forth, things that touch so many people around the world, and, might I add, our fragmentation in dealing with them would not only be shameful, it would be criminal. Because we have so much to offer together, we have so much to cooperate on. And that takes me then to the Middle East and the situation today. If we look at the Middle East, we see communities that have been there for millennia. As Coptic Christians, we believe that we are descendants of the Pharaonic culture, which has been there for 7,000 years. As Christians in Egypt, we've been there for 2,000 years. And that's not just in Egypt. Throughout the Middle East, so many of the biblical names that we see in the Old Testament are places now that are almost totally void of Christians. People who have been forced, either directly or indirectly, to leave their ancestral homelands, their places of culture and heritage, because others have just decided that they don't belong there anymore. Unfortunately, over the past 3 years in particular, we've seen ourselves go back to a medieval mindset that we would have been ashamed of 1,000 years ago, let alone today. Today, when we have human rights treaties, when we have conventions, when we have United Nations, the World Council of Churches, when we have global Islamic organizations, we have human rights organizations, when we see people sold into slavery, women sold as sex slaves, children either sold or recruited as child soldiers, when we see people burnt alive and buried alive, people decapitated. If that was a shame 1,000 years ago, then how do we perceive that today? Are the people holding the knives or the guns responsible? Or if we go one step back, are the people who are making the decisions, their lieutenants, responsible? Or if we go back a bit further, are their funders responsible? or a bit further, is the world community that has seen this persecution happening on a daily basis throughout the Middle East. Are we all equally responsible? In actual fact, if we're looking at progression and knowledge and communication, if we're looking at world order, if we're looking at social convention, then if anything, we've regressed. And we've regressed because we have seen things happen that we have been silent to. How many times have we heard of Christians in the Middle East and in Africa and other places in the world, communities that could not build churches, communities that were not able to live and proclaim their faith openly, individuals who would be discriminated against from employment, educational posts, or even just day-to-day social life, just because of their religious affiliation, particularly Christians. But unfortunately, we've seen a desensitization to a lot of that. And we have seen it as somebody else's problem. We're supposed to look at those who suffer and suffer with them, but not in a fatalistic manner of thinking that everything is crumbling, but realizing that as you do here, and you do so well, you have an ability and a right to speak, and you do, and we must. We are, to quote another very, very popular phrase these days, we are a voice for the voiceless. And we are sometimes interpreters of voices that come frantically, emotionally, and are sometimes dismissed. When we've heard Christian leaders come from the Middle East and speak passionately, it's very easy to say, oh, you're just over-exaggerating. It's fine, things are much better. Or, oh, did you hear what that person just said? What kind of Christian leader is he? Not really taking into account the pain they're coming from, the fact that they're seeing their children slaughtered in the streets, dying of poverty, alienated, displaced, people who have left everything behind and are starting completely fresh. All of that. Of course they're going to come and speak with a sense of pain. And as I said in a conference in Rome recently, I think we have a twofold responsibility. One is to speak to our brothers coming from the Middle East and help them to present their message in a way that can be heard here and accepted. Because sometimes it's a difference of culture. And we sit here at crossroads where we can take a message, slightly change the way it's delivered, and make sure that it's a much more effective message. But we must also speak to our brothers and sisters here and say, when you listen, listen sympathetically. Don't just listen to the way things are being said, but listen to what is being said. Listen to the pain. Listen to where it's coming from. Listen to these communities that have lived all of their lives as contributing members, as vehicles of reconciliation, as vehicles of peace.